This is a short video on scales and patterns for warm-ups. The reasons we play scales and patterns are a couple. One, to recognize and be able to play patterns in music, and to have a daily routine to master so that we can focus on articulation, tuning, tone quality, hand position, different fingerings. We'll start with the basic major and minor scales, then move on to other scales and patterns. Equally important to what scales we play is how we play them. A general principle I like to abide by is to have a plan and anticipate what you can and cannot do. With many, many increments, you can actually make progress with few mistakes. A scale full of mistakes makes it less likely that you'll be able to focus on tone or tuning or hand position or different fingerings. Segmenting a scale can be equally valuable to those just learning the scale and those who can already master the full range scale. I currently play scales in what I call the 4-step method. I'll silent finger the scale, I'll play the scale, I'll silent finger with metronome, and I'll play the scale with metronome. That allows me 4 times through it in slightly different ways. So let's play. As you see on this chart on the screen here, I like to play segments of 3s or 4s or 5s, a whole bunch of different ways. And right now, let's just play the A scale in 3s. And you'll notice I'll go through it 3 times. Up, then down, up, then down, up, then down. You'll hear that in a second. And then just all local ups. And then the 3rd time through the scale, all local downs. You'll hear what I mean in just a second. I won't do the 4-step way because that would simply take too long. But what I would do is I would silent finger it all the way through, and then I'll play it, which I'll do now. Here we go. A, 3s, up then down. So you heard I went through that 3 times, and then I'd silent finger that with metronome, and then I would play it with metronome. Then I'd move on to the 2nd scale, and you can cycle through your scales in any way that you want, chromatically, circle of 5ths. Right now I enjoy going through my scales in whole tones. So my next scale would be G. I'd still do all 4 steps. I'd do it slightly slower. Then my next scale I would do F, and I would skip the first 2 steps. And I'd go right to silent with metronome and then play with metronome. My 4th scale and every scale beyond that would go right to step 4, play with metronome, and it would be slightly slower. This gets us used to gets the brain out of the rut of, oh my God, is he going to do all 4 steps again? So I'm shortening the amount of time before I get to the end result. And it really quickens the brain. And for me, it helps if I slow the metronome down just a few clicks. So that explains the 4-step method. That explains just going through majors just on 3s. And as you saw on the chart, we could go through 4s, we can go through 5s and 6s and so on. So maybe I'll do a minor scale on 4s. So again, I'll go through it 3 times on D minor scale. Up and down, which on the chart, I don't know if you can see it here, on the chart, the up and down is right here, up and down in the same, and then this is all downs, and this is all ups. So that's on the chart, and if you want a copy of the chart, I can obviously send that to you, or maybe you can take a screenshot or something. But here's D, harmonic minor, 4s. First of all, the 12 majors would for me be a whole, 5 or 10 minute or maybe even more warm-up session. That would be that whole session, all 12 scales with 4-step and just on 3s. And what I just did with the D would be another whole session. I would do all 12 minor scales. I do it with the 4-step of the first 2 scales. Being all 4 steps, scale number 3, slower with just the metronome steps. And then finally, once we get to scale number 4 through 12, that's right away silent with metronome. So for me, that's enough increments that I can make progress without making a whole lot of mistakes. So before we leave major and minor scales, let me share with you a couple scales that I really enjoy playing. I enjoy playing what I call expanding scale. I'll play up to 3, up to 4, up to 5, up to 6, and so on. So you'll hear, this is a D major scale. Sorry, I don't know why I didn't go all the way down on that 1 to A, but sometimes I have a brain fart there. So I would do that on all 12 major scales, and that, again with the 4-step, that would be a whole warm-up routine, a whole technical warm-up routine. Of course, I have a tone warm-up and other things, articulation. And then I do the same thing on minors for a different warm-up routine. And let me share with you one more major and minor scale pattern that I enjoy doing. My theory is that our fingers are more deliberate, more distinct, more definitive in the down movement. So I like to practice that down and then at some point make sure the up can be just as definitive. So like here's the D scale. I'll go down 3 times. And I do that for all 12 scales. Sometimes you don't start on Do. I always end on Do. So I'll do C, starting on Mi, E. It takes me down to low D, and then after the 3rd time I'll play low C. And of course I can do that with the metronome and the 4-step and so on. So that's major and minor scales. Before we leave scales in general and go on to intervals, of course we can do chromatic scales, and again in segments, and again up and down, then just ups and then just downs. Let me see if I can just right off the top of my head do chromatic eights. And so on. And it would go all the way to the top, still locally going up. And so on. And then I got one more time through the scale, locally down. And so on. And that would go all the way up and down, still locally down. And so on. Okay, and other scales that we can work on, whole tone scales. I enjoy doing whole tone scales. Let's do whole tones in fives. We can do the whole tone scale up and down, and then change when we get to the bottom. And so on. And then like the other scale, we can just do ups. And so on. We can change the scale on the way down. Sorry. So you can give a work, and that can be in sixes and fives and eights, anything you want to do, and that's whole tone. We can do octatonic scales, and as you know, that's wholes and halves. Okay, so before we leave scales, there's endless other scales that we can play, but standard ones would be pentatonic scales, both major and minor. Bebop scales that have the minor and the major seventh in them. Blues scales, both major and minor. And again, you can change the root movement and, to chromatic and whole step, and how you can change the root movement on the way down and not just from the bottom. You can play modes. And for all of these scales, you can also do jazz articulation. So with bebop scale. I'm sorry, I missed that E flat one. And again, all the different ways to manipulate that. You can change at the top or just change at the bottom, or the bottom can be a whole step or fifth or chromatic movement or a minor third movement, however you want to do it. Now let's move on to intervals. The first big category I'll call dyads, and most people would call this, oh, these are just major scales in thirds, but you'll see later why I categorize these as dyads. So, dyads, and again, I like to do the same up and down pattern, like D in major thirds. I'll go up and down before I get to... That last time through the scale is what most of us are used to playing. But to mix it up a little bit for some variety, for some challenge, I also like to do the up-down. And so on. And you, of course, can do that with minor scales. So D minor. And again, all 12 in any one of those, either major or minor, would, with the four-step and careful work, can be a full technical warm-up for me in the mornings. We can do that on fifths, major and minor, diatonic, and fourths also, and sixths. Once we get to sixths and sevenths, it's hard for me to do the up and down. Like when I get to sevenths, I only do the standard, but let me do fifths once first. And I'll just mix it up and do E. Sorry for that mix up in the middle. And then like I was starting to say, once I get to sevenths, I really don't do the up and down. That confuses my small brain. It's hard for me to go, and it just mixes me up. So when I do sevenths, I just do the one direction. But for the fourths and fifths, and octaves also can work up and down. So you get the idea on fourths and fifths and sixths diatonically. And let me see, let's move on to, we can do all of those same exact intervals chromatically. So like here's chromatic major seconds. Up then down first. Darn it. talk, then play, talk, then play, talk, then play, and all different patterns. So, and we can do that also with chromatic minor thirds, chromatic major thirds, chromatic perfect fourths. So let me see if I can do perfect fourths right off the bat here. So. Sorry for the blips. Again, I only do those up to perfect fifths. Maybe if I really want a big challenge, maybe I'll also do larger intervals at sixths and sevenths. So let's see. Oh, yeah, there's one really crazy one that I started working, expanding intervals. We can keep one of the, either the top or the bottom the same. Like for example, that's keeping the bottom the same. That just happened to be D. And I could keep the E flat on the bass or C sharp or whatever I want to keep on the bottom. Then I'll keep the top the same. Let me see, bigger intervals. Or let's see. That was keeping the top the same. Or really hard is expanding in both directions. So I'm going to play C, then C sharp, B, then D, B flat, E flat, A flat, F, G, F sharp, G, and so on. So you'll hear. It's a finger and a brain teaser. So I do that on all different starting pitches, and it gives you a range of 2 octaves. So I do that on B flat through F or F sharp. You can't do it. Yeah, I guess you could do it on G. Which does remind me, every single scale I've mentioned so far, you can do into the altissimo. So that would just double the amount of material we have to work with. Okay, so the next group after dyads would be triads. And of course, we'd all have worked on arpeggios. And again, let me just remind you that I think it's important to do the up and down, not just the up. So like in G diatonic, but you get the idea. We could do that with minor arpeggios. We can do that with diminished arpeggios and augmented arpeggios. And then again, once we get into these kind of chromatic ones like augmented, we could change the root either on the bottom or we could change it also at the top. And so on. So there's a lot of different ways we can play with that. We can also, moving into non-diatonic ones, we can do chromatic major triads. And so on, and then I do up and down there, and then just ups. And then of course we come down also. And so on, locally down, but up and down the whole scale. You get the idea. And then we could move into other larger chromatic intervals. Also, I'll still call these triads because it includes 3 notes. Like, for example, perfect fourths. Okay, we can also do it with the root movement changing on the way down. Sorry. Ways to work that. Do that with tritones, do that with perfect fifths, all these chromatic bigger intervals. And again, the root movement can change on the bottom or the top. The root movement can change by half step or whole step or minor third or fifth or however you want to do it. The next group would be 4 notes or tetrachords, 4-note chords. And again, those could be major 7th, dominant 7ths, minor 7ths, half diminished 7ths, fully diminished 7ths, or we could even go in, those can all be diatonically or chromatic root movements, or we can even go into the larger intervals like the fourths. I could do 4 notes on fourths. And so on. So again, just I'm categorizing these in the number of notes in each group there. And then one more thing in groups of fourths. I don't know if you can see this because it's in a different color on the chart, but here is 24 different ways to pattern 4 notes. Like the first says 1, 2, 3, 5, and I can go through the whole scale as all 1, 2, 3, 5s. And then 1, 2, 5, 3, 1, 3, 2, 5, 1, 3, 5, 2, and there's 24 different patterns how we can order 4 notes. Of course, we can start on 1s, we can start on 2, we can start on 3, and so on. That would take way too long to show you. And I can only get through one key diatonically or chromatically for each one of those sets in a warm-up. Okay, then after that, we'll do 5-note chords. We could do major ninths, dominant ninths and minor ninths, and again the root pattern can change, the root can change on the top and the bottom. And finally, to wrap up from the diatonic and the chromatic intervals and scales, let me mention just a couple other ones. In the flute book, Taffanel and Gobert, I forget which one it is, maybe is it number 1 or number 5? But that scale, we go up to sol, and then that sol becomes the T to the next scale up. Other unusual ones that I like to play. Sometimes because my pinky is such a weak pinky in my left hand, sometimes I'd like to play just a whole day of scales that use the pinky. So I'll play the A flat major and the E flat major and the C minor and the F minor and the A flat minor, and those in thirds also, because those give the pinky a quick workout. Sometimes I'll just do just the palm keys. Sometimes I'll just choose a small segment and just work out the altissimo notes. And then one last one, which is a really weird one. I call it just the physical workout. It really doesn't have a tonal workout at all. Like I'll just wiggle this first finger, sometimes the other notes down and sometimes up. And then I'll wiggle just the middle finger. And then just the third finger. And just the fourth finger, and then I'll go to pairs. Here's 1 and 2. And then it starts to get really hard. 1 and 3. So the 1 and 3 are always moving, sometimes with 2 and 4 down, sometimes with 2 and 4 up. And then, of course, go through other patterns like 1 and 4, and then 3 and 4, and so on. And then, instead of using 2 fingers, I'll do them consecutively. Instead of those 1 and 2 moving together, I'll move them different. And then I'll do 2 before 1. It really gives the left hand a really good workout. I probably have forgotten a few, and I can find examples of almost all of these tonal patterns in music. It helps if we can recognize these as a single pattern and not just 8 or 12 notes. If you have other patterns, I'd love to hear about them, or comments from this. Please let me know. Thanks.